Greetings. I'm Steve, and I'd like to thank you for joining the Architect and the Executive podcast, where we discuss technology, philosophy, leadership, personal development, and much more. The theme for each episode varies as we endeavor to examine various topics from our unique points of view. I hope you enjoy this episode of the Architect and the Executive. In this episode, we continue our mindfulness discussion with a deeper dive into yoga and Stoicism and how we use these philosophies in our daily lives. We focus on the origins of these two schools of thought and how similar they really are despite the obvious differences at the surface. Please enjoy this episode of The Architect and the Executive. Hey, Imran, welcome back to the next episode of The Architect and the Executive.
Hi, Steve. Thank you. How are you today?
You know, I'm doing really well. I'm excited to dive into episode 5. Just so everybody knows, this is picking up from episode 4. It really has been a few days. We didn't just keep going and do a costume change and get right back into it. But we were super excited about where we were and all the things we talked about last week. And we're hoping that you guys enjoyed it and that you'll be on for the next hour with us on the next journey more into the philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, as a quick recap, last week we covered mindfulness and meditation and how, engineers and people can incorporate it into their workday to help make them better problem solvers and decision makers. And so, Steve and I both have personal philosophies that we follow when it comes to those things, mindfulness, meditation, and what we read and how we practice it. And, for me and Steve, that has always been, it's yoga and Stoicism. And so today we're going to talk about what those two things mean to us.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm super excited. I think I'll start and I'll define yoga. Right? I have a pretty good handle, and yoga is really when a bunch of people get together with their towels and their little mat, and they're all in a room, and everybody, sits down and stretches out, and then they do aerobic exercise. That's yoga, right?
Right. And I think Stoicism, to me means that you're just generally devoid of emotion and you feel nothing no matter what's happening around you, and just very cold-hearted, right?
Yeah, I think, we've pretty much nailed it right there. So as you guys can see, we've got some room to improve. Maybe those aren't exactly the right definitions of those two things, but I think those are pretty common misconceptions, or maybe they're just conceptions of how those things are, but it's really a lot different than that. So why don't you start with yoga, and what does yoga mean to you, Imran?
Yeah, I will. And so yoga is really about union, right? It's about oneness with the universe and basically connecting, human to the divine. And so when you talk about it, it's about understanding yourself and your true nature, because you want to understand the universe. And the universe is out there, and you're not going to ever reach it fully with rockets and fuel and spaceships, because you can only go so far. But once you realize that you were created in the image of the universe and you turn your focus inwards, then there's no limit to how far you can explore. And if you can understand yourself on that deep level, then you can become one with the universe.
That's amazing. And I think it's interesting because the focus of Stoicism for me is not to be devoid of emotion. Everyone has emotions. You're going to have them, but it's more about learning that emotion doesn't have to rule everything you're doing every day, right? There might be something that happens, something goes wrong, you oversleep, you might be upset, but you don't have to let that feeling take away from what you need to do, your actions, right? It's that, what can you do? What's the only thing that's really in your control, right? You can't control whether it rains or whether, a project does this or that, or someone else does something. You can really only control your reactions and your thoughts to things. And it is to help you understand who you are in this universe, right? It's not just you alone. It's you as a member of a community, or, as you put it, in, a member of the universe.
Right. So I want to start off, as we talk about yoga, with a little story. And it's a story that I've adapted and kind of paraphrased from a book called Adiyogi by Sadhguru. And as we go into this, let's talk about this 4-letter word, guru, right? You hear it all the time, and I think it's another one of those words that gets thrown around very lightly. But,
sure.
What is a guru, right? And, is it a teacher, a guide, a mentor? It's really, guru is someone who sheds light on the path, right? They're not taking you down the path. They're not pushing you down the path. They're just shedding light on the path. They're not creating the path either, right? So it's not about a matter of belief. It's about experience. And your guru wants you to experience the universe for yourself. And so all he does is shed a light on the path. So, because you can't talk about the story of the origin of yoga without really talking about the origin of the first yogi or the first guru, because that's where it begins.
Sure.
And when we talk about Adiyogi, we talk about Shiva, and not in the sense of the god, in the religious sense. This story predates religion by thousands of years, and these concepts do as well. But more of the being that just appeared. So 15,000 years ago, a being appeared in the upper reaches of the Himalayas. No one had ever seen anything like him. He was 9 feet tall, ash smeared. He had long flowing matted hair. Sometimes he stood perfectly still, and other times he danced. When he danced, it was ecstatic and extraordinary, indescribable, right? Planets, rivers, forests, and stars exploded into life around the being when he danced. And when he sat still, he became the ageless silence at the heart of creation, and he seemed to become life itself. So people gathered around him because his presence was extraordinary, right? They were drawn to him. He would sit there with his eyes closed still for days and months, and people were waiting for a miracle. They were gathered around. They're like, this being is here, and they're waiting for a miracle. And they didn't realize that the true miracle was him sitting still in front of them for so long, and his ability to do so. That was the miracle that was happening. So once everyone kind of got bored, they left. 7 men stayed around. And they waited there until the being opened his eyes. And they begged it to teach him his ways. And he dismissed them at first. He said, this is not for entertainment, But they were relentless, and they persevered. And so eventually he couldn't ignore their commitment to his ways and what he was doing. So he taught them. He taught them yoga. And he started teaching them the ways of the universe. And essentially, this is how he became the first yogi. And what he taught them, and which is this oneness in the nature of the universe, is what we call yoga. And so those 7 sages spread around to the different continents, and they planted the seeds of the evolution of human consciousness. 'Cause this was the first time the realization came that we were not only evolving physically, but we had a way to evolve consciously. And when it came to this, this freedom is within all of us to seek and become boundless, and that freedom is what he called yoga.
That's super interesting to me. And as you and I have talked about the differences in the language of yoga and Stoicism and other philosophies, there's a lot of crossover. And I think the interesting piece you mentioned there is the stillness, right? That is a huge component of being a Stoic. Can you actually sit with yourself in silence, be still, and be okay with what's going on in your mind? And I think a lot of people that are listening to us today are like, ooh, no, that doesn't sound good. I don't want to sit in a quiet room. Right? People are afraid of being in a quiet room and not having other things going on. Like they feel like they're missing out on something if they don't have a whole lot of noise or input. And it's Blaise Pascal, who was a mathematician and a physicist and inventor, among other things. He has a quote that I really enjoy, and it's, all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. And here, that goes straight back to the story you were just telling, right? The idea that people couldn't believe that the most important thing going on in front of them was someone being still.
Right. And one thing Sadhguru always says is that if you can't be still in a room by yourself, that must mean you're in bad company. and so, you have to come to terms with that, right?
Sure. And you do. And I've read one of the Sadhguru books, The Inner Engineering, and it was amazing to me, the amount of similarity. And I know you and I talked about this at the time, between what I had been reading from Seneca and Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. They all say really the same things about the same ideas of stillness and understanding what's in your control and how to be one with the universe, right? I think the Greeks, when they kind of started on their journey for enlightenment, it was about how do we organize the world around us and understand our mental capacity, and how do we deal with the gods, right? There wasn't one. This is it was religion, but it was really a different idea than what we think about today. But it was more about how do we deal with the idea that we're all together, we're all part of something, there's something bigger than us that's going on. And I think that the yoga tradition is that same sort of thing, right? It's not just you. It is that you're a member, a being of something much larger.
Yeah, it's about the oneness aspect, right? So you mentioned stillness. What are some of the other tenets? What are some of the major, you saw how I thought of Stoicism, right? And I think that's a conception we have, is that
right.
Stoics are defined by their inability to feel or chosen ability to not feel. Let's put it that way, right?
Sure.
What's the reality for you when it comes to Stoicism?
Yeah, for me, it is very much about, can I take all of the things that are happening in a day, whatever it might be, whatever's in that moment, and accept it for what it is. So it's not good or bad. It's something that happened, right? I could be anything. I could be walking through the house and trip over a toy, right? The dog left something out. I tripped over it. That's not good or bad, right? I might fall down. I might land, whatever it is. I might stub my toe. That's not a good or a bad thing. It's something that happened, and can I accept it? Maybe. The big key there is, can you practice wanting what happened and not wanting something else, right? If you're always wanting, you hear people, oh boy, I want to win the lottery. Well, okay. You've set a pretty high bar. How about you want whatever it is that's going on right now? You want that toy to have been left out so that you tripped over it. And if you want what happens, you'll truly always be happy. The other piece of that is, for me, with Stoicism, is just understanding the things that I can control. And it's a pretty small set of things that I can control. And it stops with my thoughts. Like, that's it. I can only control what I'm thinking and the judgments that I apply to things and the actions that I take. I can't control what you do. I can't control what anyone else does. Right. Can't control my wife or kids or dog. I can only control my thoughts. And I think that's the most important tenet of Stoicism, is directly around that. Can you understand? Can you learn the things you can control?
So I think a big commonality listening to that is between both of them is, no matter what's happening around you, the only thing you have control over is how you experience it.
Yeah.
Right. And so then once you realize it's a choice, wouldn't you always choose to be joyful?
Right.
You touched on some tenets there that we talk about in yoga, the inevitability of the moment, right? It happened. It's there. It's inevitable. There's nothing that can change this moment. Nothing. Not even you.
Right.
Not even God could change this moment. It just happened. So you have to come to that realization. Okay, acceptance is that, right? The same tenet. So we talk about the inevitability in the frame of acceptance, right? Wanting what happened. And so the idea is that you're responsible for your life. The nature of your life is the responsibility of your decisions. So no matter what happened to you, you have to realize that it is there. And when we talk about karma, right? I'm going to use that as a segue into karma. And you often hear karma in the terms of, it's good karma, bad karma, right?
Right.
There's no such thing. Karma is about action. Every time you move, you take a breath, you turn your head, you're generating karma. And so all of this is about your action and the action that you put and what comes back to you in that sense. And we're all here to resolve our past karma. And so whatever those things that happen to us, you do want that to happen to you, because that is the return action that's resolving you of past karma that you generated to begin with. Right. And if you view it that way, then you could be joyful even about those types of things, right?
About anything. And I think that's the big piece, right? It's a choice that you make. And I don't know that we might have touched on it in episode 1 about the choice every day to be happy. I choose every day that I'm going to be happy. I might get up in the morning and know that I have 12 hours of meetings that I have to go to. I can still choose to be happy. I got up. I was able to fulfill my purpose. I'm a human. I'm meant to live. I'm meant to go be part of something and do things. I can be happy about that. Sure, a lot of meetings, a lot of things going on, but whatever else it is, I can still make that choice, and I can understand that what I do impacts how my day's going to go. But as long as I can remember and practice, that's the big key here, which I think we'll touch on a couple times. This takes practice. It's easy to say, much, much harder to do, but that you can choose how you want to be, right? You just say you got pulled over, right? Okay. You made a choice to speed, for example, or to not stop at that stop sign, and you got pulled over. You made a choice. That's your life. That's your karma coming right back at you pretty quick,
that's pretty
right?
Instant.
Right? That's instant feedback on what you were doing. But it was a choice you made. And you're like, oh my God, there was a police officer right there. I can't believe that. Okay. Well, why not? That's just another thing that happened. You can't be mad at that person. They're doing their job. They made a choice as well to pull you over for not following a rule that we've all agreed to. It's just something that happened. Don't get all bent out of shape. Don't let that ruin your day. Don't let that ruin the next, 6 hours where all you can think about is, I can't believe that guy pulled me over. That's so not fair. You made a choice.
Right. So you mentioned something a couple of times now, and I want to touch on that. And it's that something just happened, right? Things happen all around you, and you got to realize that they're not happening to you. And that's where you kind of have to take a step back, right? And that's where that ego identity comes from, and letting go of that and really understanding your true self, because this body is not you. This mind is not you, right? Even this energy is not you. It's things that you inhabit. You're borrowing this body from this planet. And so if you can separate yourself from those things that are happening and be a witness to your life, right? And then you look at, pain, pleasure, joy, sadness, happiness, sorrow. Those are all just things that are happening. They're not happening to you.
Right.
And you're just witnessing them.
It's a really, again, because I study and I practice, I understand that differentiation. But that's hard, right? Because most people who are listening to us are like, come on, guys, really? I can't. Right. It doesn't just happen. It does. Take a step back and realize the things that are going on are happening. Did the sun shine today? Maybe, maybe not. Did you have any control over it? No, but it happened, right? Did you get pulled over?
But if you assumed that it happened for you, you would say that you had an ego problem, right?
Right.
Like the sun rose for me today. Like it didn't,
Yeah.
I mean, it rose and you experienced it, but that's an extreme level. But it's easy to laugh at that and say, oh, okay, the sun didn't rise for you. But when something else happens, like you stub your toe on a toy that you're walking by, can you look at that and say, that didn't just happen to me? It just happened, right?
Right.
The pain that I experience is an evolutionary response to this body. It's information to alert me about my environment. Is it something to suffer from? No, it's information.
No. Suffering
I choose to suffer from it.
Exactly. Suffering and pain are completely different, right? You feel pain. You choose suffering. Like, are you going to now lament the fact that you just stubbed your toe and it hurts, and now it's going to distract you for the next 5 minutes because all you can think about is, oh my God, I can't believe I stubbed my toe. Why was that toy left out? That's so wrong. Why didn't they pick up? All of those things are suffering. Imagine if all you did was say, oh, wow, okay, yep, that hurt. Let's make sure I didn't break it. All right, done. Let's move on. Now you're not suffering. Yeah, maybe there's some pain, but pain is just information about your environment. It doesn't have to mean more. I scuba dive, and I learned how to free dive. So free dive is breath hold diving. And you learn pretty quickly that your body is built to provide you with a lot of information when you hold your breath. And you can experience this for yourself. Take in a deep breath, exhale twice as long as you breathe in, and then hold your breath and count to 10. Your body will tell you right away, hey, you need to breathe. It's giving you some information about your environment. You don't need to. You only exhale half of your volume of your lungs in a normal inhale, exhale. So you have plenty of air and oxygen and what you need, but your body has evolved to say, that's not what you normally do. We need to do something different. Go back to what we normally do. I like that better. But once you learn that you can hold your breath much longer than you think possible, you've found a new way to experience things. It's a new thing because it's not happening to you. You're part of it and it's happening, but it doesn't have to happen to you. You don't have to let that pain be what drives your next action.
Right. We definitely do a good job of creating our own suffering in that sense.
We sure do. There's plenty of that going around. Yeah.
So when we talk about, control and what we can control, how else do you look at, certain things, when they happen around you and when you get into different situations, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you're in that moment?
For me, I spend time, again, in practice so that when I'm engaging with people or doing things or interacting in some way, that I'm not consciously thinking about what are the things that are inside or outside of my control, but I am trying to remember that my reaction is what's something that I can do. So say you're having a conversation here in a meeting and somebody says something that you don't agree with, or maybe they call you out or attack you directly, or again, they're not attacking you. They might be attacking something you've done. You don't have to immediately respond. You can take a deep breath. I remember when I was young, there used to be commercials about before you act, count to 10. I used to remember seeing that sort of stuff. I don't remember what it was for on TV, but before you react, count to 10.
Or something.
Yeah, I'm sure. There's probably more to it, and my brain is only remembering a little bit of it. But those are really good practices. The other thing that I really try to do is not assign a value to whatever it was. So you might say something in a conversation and someone says something counter to how you think things are, to what your understanding of reality is. They don't have to be wrong. It doesn't have to be bad. They don't have to be evil. You don't have to put a negative connotation on what was said. You can stop and think about what it was and maybe try to understand just what they said without placing your own value judgments on it. And I remember reading something, and I don't remember the book. It might have been Malcolm Gladwell, something, but thinking about how quickly we make value judgments, and they're almost instantaneous. So stopping that process is really hard. Your body is geared to figure out, is something good or bad for me? Like, is it dangerous for me? Not good or bad, but is it danger? And it's immediate. It figures that stuff out. It applies a value judgment that if you're not conscious of it, you can only ever see the world one way. And that is probably one of the bigger things, the bigger challenges that I work on as I think about the control that I would like to have in my life.
Gotcha. So all those make me think of the same thing, and that's really about ego, right? And essentially taking things personally, right? And
sure.
When we drop those things and we can step away from them, then we don't have to suffer. And it seems like that's what you're doing in your mind, is that you're almost removing yourself from the equation and looking at what's happening objectively without, putting yourself into it.
Right.
Yeah.
No,
another thing
go ahead.
I wanted to go into, another thing that we go into with yoga is, aside from identity, is the sense of responsibility, right? And your ability to respond to your environment that's around you. And it's not responsibility in the sense of ego, in the sense of obligation, right? We look at responsibility and obligation, we use those two words interchangeably.
Right. But
really, it's more of a sense of response. And the idea is, again, to make yourself limitless. And so when we think of responsibility, it's, I'll give a simple example here. It's like, let's say you're walking down the street and there's some kind of medical emergency and you see it, right? If you ignore it and you keep going, you've limited yourself, right? You're unable to respond to this thing. But if you respond to it, then you make yourself limitless. Now, response and action are two different things as well.
Right.
Right?
Right.
So you act based on your physical abilities and means, but your ability to respond internally is limitless. All right. But then you can choose to not act, which is a choice. We talked about this, in fact, in programming.
Right.
Right.
It sure is. Yeah.
And it's like, you can choose to not act on something, and that's something. But it's different from ignoring something, right? Ignoring something and choosing not to act are two different things. So you may be the one who calls 911, right?
Yeah.
You may be a doctor, and you may actually physically go check and see what's happening, right? You may come across it and all those actions are done, right? All the necessary actions are taken. Someone's checked on him. Doctor is called, 911 is called, but you'd at least share some concern for the person,
Sure.
right? And so again, you're still responding. Your action is based on the necessity of the moment and what you're capable of, but you do respond to everything around you. And I think that's a big tenet. How do you look at that, or how does Stoicism look at that tenet?
So I think in kind of in a couple of different ways. So when I think about how do I react, like in that sort of situation, I have Stoics look at justice as being vitally important, and not the idea of applying value to things, but seeking out justice and doing the right thing. So think about that situation. I'm walking down the street. I see someone has fallen. They're clearly injured. By choosing to ignore that, I've not put forth the courage to act, to your point. I've chosen not to respond or to ignore. And then I'm clearly not doing the right thing by, I think, anyone's measure of that. But internally, you would, analyze if you looked at yourself and said, I had the ability to do something for that person. That would have been the right thing. That would have been towards justice. Why did I choose not to? What made me think that doing something else or ignoring it or choosing not to act was the way to go? You have to have the wisdom. That's the other, tenet. Courage, justice, wisdom, temperance. You put all of those things together, and in that situation, you expect yourself. It's not someone else's expectation of you, but you expect yourself to be able to react in that situation and be a member of society, right? That was one of the big tenets of Stoicism. Marcus Aurelius writes about it all the time, that how do you contribute? How do you give back or be part of what's going on? Be part of the human condition, as opposed to walling yourself off and not having any emotion, right? It was never that. It was much more, how do I understand that these things will happen? Something may die, but I don't have to be devastated by it. I have to understand that was a change in something that would happen. By the way, we all die, right? It will all happen. I have a tattoo on my arm that reminds me of that every single day. Memento mori, right? That's part of what's going on. But, thinking about what do you do in that situation? You would want to take the best action towards justice. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. That does. So I touched on something as I was talking about responsibility, and that was limitlessness, right? And one other thing of the human condition is that we want to be limitless, and I think we interpret that sometimes in the wrong way. And the example I'll give is your office cubicle, right? Let's say you have a job and you work in a cubicle. So you got promoted and your cubicle got a little bigger. Cool, you got excited. I feel good. Everything's happy. My cubicle's bigger. Eventually, you'll become aware of your boundaries.
Right.
And then you'll want the big corner office. So then you get promoted, you get the big corner office, you got the windows, more space, right? If that cubicle was 100 by 100 foot, you'd eventually still become aware of its boundaries. If it was 1,000 by 1,000 foot, you'd eventually still become aware. So the idea is you want to become boundless. We have this natural urge to become boundless. And it's not through a sense of material means or gain in that sense, but we want everything. It's not that you want $1 million or $1 billion. It's you want the whole universe, and you have to realize that you can have the whole universe. But and that's something that's, again, turning inward and to make yourself limitless, right? Is you can gain all that. So how do you look at that from a Stoic sense?
It's funny that you say that. It's a little different, at least in my mind. One of the things I've been working on really diligently over the last couple of years is wanting what I have. So it's not placing value and not putting energy towards wanting the bigger cubicle or the corner office, but instead it's focusing on, I have this. I'm sitting in a small office right now at a writing desk, and it's exactly what I want. Right? I find that is, I don't need anything bigger. I don't need a different desk. I don't want a different desk. You see a really nice car drive down the street, and there's a difference between appreciating that car and going, ooh, boy, how great would my life be if I had that, right? You've now limited yourself. Now there's something external to you that you might not be able to achieve. Maybe that was a custom car. Maybe it was a one of a kind. Maybe it cost $300,000. Maybe that's not the kind of value you would put on it, but all of a sudden you're spending cycles on, man, I've seen a limit that I can't reach. And now you have limited what you can do. You've limited your happiness because you can't achieve that. But if you stop and think about, well, I have a car in the garage and it gets me everywhere I need to go. I have a desk. I have a place where I can work from. Wow, those are pretty good things to have. I can go do the things I need to do with those just the same. Maybe it is pretty. I'm not trying to keep up with the Joneses, right? I'm trying to keep up with me, and I don't really ever think about it as being limitless, but I think about it more along the lines of wanting what I have because it allows me to dedicate more time to the things I want to do.
That makes sense. I think that notion puts you in control of your happiness again, right?
Very much.
And that's one of the ideas, right? Is we want to live consciously and we don't want to live accidentally. Right now, a lot of people live accidentally.
Sure.
Whether you're going to be happy or sad tomorrow, you don't know.
Right? Or you're depending on someone else, right?
Yeah. Something might happen that ruined your day, and something might happen on the other side that made your day awesome, right? And even in the Buddhist, you look at it and you don't even want to be too puffed up by good news,
right,
just as much as you don't want to be saddened by bad news. You don't want these external things to affect your mood, and being able to do conscious things with yourself to drive where you are. One of the things in yoga that's very common we haven't really talked about is the postures and the positions. And where does that come from, right? Like, I'll give you a simple exercise that I learned when I went to the inner engineering retreat in Tennessee. Is if you just kind of sitting here and put your palms on your knees facing down, and breathe in and out, right? Do a quick breath. And feel where your breath is going. Like, you're going to feel it in the lower part of your stomach, kind of lower end of your diaphragm here. Now, just face your palm upward and do the same breath. Do you feel it in a different place? Yeah, right? You might feel it more.
I was going to say, it actually felt it was a little higher of the center. Yeah.
Right. So just these little things, that's a position. And so anything, again, just how like everything you do is karma, and we talk about yoga asanas, which are different positions. Everything you do, every movement is a position. It's just that there were a certain number of positions that were identified to be effective in certain ways, and those become the yoga poses that you know. And so the idea is that, here's another analogy, I guess, is if you ever looked at someone, you're at a party and they were upset, or you think about yourself when you were upset. How were you sitting, right? How was that person sitting?
Okay. What's your body language?
Slumped over, right? So the idea there, and you inherently understand, is that your state of mind will affect your posture.
For sure.
So the inverse is also true. Your posture can affect your state of mind. So if you take a certain posture, then you can create a certain chemistry within you and experience that in a certain sense, right? And so the idea is just preparing your body for that next level. Yeah.
I think it was a TED Talk that I watched at one point that talked a little bit about like the boss pose and being pumped up, getting yourself ready to go do a speech or something like that. And it was standing in a certain way, and somebody else, I could swear I saw a TED Talk about if you really want to feel better about walking into something where you're a little unsure, sit down at your desk and put your feet up on your desk. Because there's no more sign of I own this space and what I'm doing than hands behind your head and feet up on the desk. And It's a mental shift. Like, your brain is like, oh, yeah, totally, we're good here. I mean, the postures matter. You mentioned, somebody looks sad or you see him in a party. You can tell the same thing about someone that's mad. I will just throw out there that, guys, if you're dating someone and your girlfriend looks mad and she says she's not, she really is. Like, just assume that body language is right and then let it go until she's ready to talk about it. It's a side note, just throwing that out there. But those things matter. If you're totally closed off or you're standoffish, the other thing that I learned when I did sales early on in my professional life was how you present yourself in an interaction, the other person will mirror. So if you were trying to convince someone that they wanted to buy a product and you're standing there with your hands closed in front of you and you look like a bouncer, they don't want to buy your product. But if you put your hands behind your back and you open up, your shoulders are back and you have an open posture, they're much more likely to listen to you. And when I read that, I was like, come on, that's nonsense. 40-year-old me would slap 20-year-old me for not realizing how true that was immediately. It worked. I learned it. I built that into the way I worked on things. But man, it makes such a difference how you present yourself. And for those of you who are listening that are in meetings or you happen to be, together in physical spaces, how you look around the table matters to the people who are around the table with you. What that looks like. If you look like you're laid back and totally aloof, people are going to assume, right or wrong, they are going to apply their judgments in most cases, because you won't run into a lot of practicing Stoics every day in your meetings, that you're aloof. Most, people, it's fairly automatic. You have to overcome that. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about your posture and your poses.
Yeah, a lot of that takes me back to an oral communications class I took in college, and we talk about just that, right? Because that body language, you're communicating even when you're not speaking words.
Right.
Words are, depending on who you ask, 7 to 10%. So even on the high end, words are 10% of your communication.
Right.
Right. Your tone is another half of what's left, and your body language is the rest.
Right.
And people will debate exactly where that number lies, but it's just generally around where it is. And so, right, when you give that body language, and it can be misinterpreted, right? It totally can, but perception frames reality.
It does.
And that's what you have to understand for people. And so when you give a certain perception, that's the reality that is going to be in their mind. And we talk about this in one sense, because we talk about when people judge us and talking about what you can control and what you can, and what you should suffer from and what you shouldn't.
Sure.
Right? And there's two sides of this. And one is that if you're in a place where you're presenting yourself to other people, you want to present the best version of yourself. And that's all around,
right?
Because all they know is what they're getting from you in the moment. All right. And likewise, on the other side, if you're in a situation where someone's talking about you or has a negative opinion about you for what other reason, it's nothing to stay up at night over, because ultimately that person's opinion of you is not really your business, because it's theirs and it's what goes on within them, and whatever frame they want to create for themselves is okay for them.
Right.
Right. And so you just have to navigate that balance. It's, again, not something to suffer from, but just something to be aware of.
Yeah. That's kind of funny that you mentioned. One of my favorite Stoic quotes is that, when you've heard someone is speaking bad of you, simply reply to the person who's telling you, this third party, well, it's clear that they don't know me very well, or they wouldn't have only mentioned those faults. Right. I have that on my office, my virtual office. It's there, right? It's true. What you present and how people think about you just isn't, it's not something that you can control again, right? They would mention much more. And I think on the other side of that is we all, I assume, hold ourselves to a fairly high standard internally, what we expect from ourselves. And the Stoic side of that is be strict with yourself, but lenient with others. Give everyone else the benefit of the doubt. You don't know where they're coming from. Maybe they've had a terrible day. Maybe they've just been kicked one time after another, and now you're interacting with them and they're in a bad mood. They've let whatever the day is really affect them. And now your interaction doesn't have to be colored by your expectations of them. You can say, those are my expectations that I'm going to approach it this way, but I'll let them be however they are, right? Be lenient with them. And give them the benefit of the doubt. I think you'll find that a lot of your interactions go a lot better. And we have some of that. I know working in our virtual world, you lose the body language piece and you lose the body language feedback because we're all avatars. So you have to let some of that go. You can't assume sarcasm or not sarcasm in written word, right? There isn't a markdown for sarcasm. There really should be. So there's some really smart people listening to this. Please figure out how to use sarcasm markdown. I'd love that. But you can't know. So just allow yourself to assume that person meant the absolute best in whatever they wrote or said, right? Or however they act.
Yeah, because until you know, otherwise you're reacting to something that you've made up in your mind.
Right.
And it's not real yet. So let it be real. And if that's how they felt, let that be and then respond to it.
Right.
But until that moment, don't react to something that doesn't really exist, right?
Yeah.
One more thing. So I want to bring in another school of thought here because we talk about all the similarities here. And so there's another book I read recently, and it's called The Mastery of Self by, I believe, Don Miguel Ruiz. And he has these 4 agreements when he talks about it. So as we talk about desires, attachments, right, he uses the same kind of terminology. I think he uses more attachments in the same way we use identities and things. And then this is more of a Toltec Central American tradition and where it comes from. But the 4 agreements, number 1 is be impeccable with your word, right? Number 2 is don't take anything personally. Number 3 is don't make assumptions. And number 4 is always do your best.
Man,
right?
So that guy's clearly a Stoic.
Secrets of life. Right, yeah, or a yogi.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yep.
So we think about these things and it's like we almost have to put our guards up. We shouldn't have to. It's like if everyone was a Stoic yogi, if everyone thought in the same way, then we wouldn't need to worry too much about perception. Right. Because there'd be reality, right? And because it's not. And one thing Sadhguru always says is that if you knew you had a choice and you always chose to be joyful, then no one would need to tell you to have morals or ethics. No one would tell you to need to be nice to someone else because you would treat everyone as yourself.
Right.
And as you realize that we're all one, then you realize that is yourself, right? That's another way of looking at it. Like when you see a homeless person on the streets come ask you for money, that's you asking you for money.
Right.
Right. And you have to view it that way.
And it is hard. I know years ago, I think we were still living in New York. We ran into someone on the street whose car was broken down. And I had my wife and 2 young kids with me at the time. And this woman's car, I think she had run out of gas. And she's like, can you do anything to help me? And I think I had asked, hey, are you okay? And ended up giving her a ride. Got her, into the car with the wife and kids. We went to a gas station and I dropped her off there and she was gave her money so she could go buy gas and a gas can and then get back to her car. And she seemed to be overwhelmed by the fact that I would be willing to do that. And my kids were looking at me like, well, that was strange. Why would we do that? And it turned into a really interesting lesson about that, right? That could have been us. It could have been me. Had I made different choices that day, could have been the one who was stranded on the side of the road and not able to afford to go get gas, right? I don't always think about it the same way that, that you described, like this is me helping me, but I more ascribe to that idea that I want to pay that forward. I see someone that needs some help and next time it might be me who needs the help. And I want to put that out there. I want that to be the default that people take. So I want to model that behavior.
Beautiful. Well said. Well, as we wrap up another episode of The Architect and the Executive, I want to be a little ambitious and introduce our next few episodes. I know we kind of talked about this, but, we've been on the soft skill side for a couple of episodes.
Yeah.
And I think it's time to go in hard and work on some technical things. So we're planning on putting together, I don't know how many parts it's going to be. I know it's going to be more than 1. It may be 3, maybe 2, maybe 10. But talking about using low code at scale in an enterprise environment.
Right.
And the challenges that we've run into, the successes that we've had, and all the things in between.
Right. I'm excited. I think we have a pretty unique experience on how we use a low code environment. And also how we're trying to grow and the new requirements that we have organizationally, that maybe a lot of people don't think about when it comes to, how do you work in low code? So I'm super, super excited for it. I think you're right. It'll probably be a couple episodes. I'm sure we'll still throw in some philosophy. I hope people have enjoyed this conversation. As always, we love to hear from you guys. One thing I did want to mention, you guys may have seen, we're both wearing our Do You Even Bastion Bro shirts that came out of some conversations, again, by Glow Your Soul for these. And great t-shirts. Again, hidden meetings, inside jokes. When you need that thing to just, have a little bit of fun with your team, this is the way to go. And Imran and I were in the Netherlands a couple years ago, and we actually found a hotel called the Bastion. And we went with these shirts on and took pictures next to the Bastion Hotel because, well, we just had to. That's actually why we picked the hotel, because it was called the Bastion.
One of the reasons, yeah. It was, it's why because when you don't know where you're looking at,
that's right.
It's like you have to find a reason to make a choice,
Precisely. And that one worked.
So, yeah. Well, thank you everyone for listening. Whatever directory you're on, wherever you're listening, if you're on YouTube, like us, follow us, subscribe to us.
Please.
So you get alerts and we put out a new episode every week, and we'll talk to you next week.
All right. Thanks, y'all. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Architect and the Executive, a podcast by Imran Kassam and Steve Ledwith. We hope you enjoyed this episode and encourage you to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. All of our episodes, show notes, and articles can be found on our website, thearchitectandtheexecutive.com. Thank you.